the way, oh, yeah, great. So, what I thought I would talk about today are the ways that people think about their lives, think about other lives, and how they judge them. And my two examples, not surprisingly, given the themes of this course, will be to begin with common ways this occurs in Euro-American thinking, both commonsensical ways of talking, as well as some of the classic novels of the past couple of centuries. And then, of course, I will be turning to classical China and looking at implicitly what are the notions of the self there, how are histories of the self being narrated, and what kinds of judgments are being made about the ways people have lived their lives. So let me begin with the standard Euro-American ones. At the beginning, I'll just sort of repeat some points we've made before, but I'll do so for reasons that will become obvious as I get into some of these novels and discuss how these play out. So to begin with very standard American ones that we will commonly use to think about our lives, justify our lives, or be judgmental about others who we think are failing to do this. So in America, the standard way of doing this, as we've mentioned, is you always have to be true to yourself, right? So as long as I am truly loving and embracing who I really am, that justifies what I'm doing. So if I throw a horrible temper tantrum at poor Paul, I can say, oh, okay, well, I was just in a stressful period, but that's just me. The argument being, as long as that's just me, that in a stressful time, I'll throw a temper tantrum, that's okay. And Paul should still, well, I won't say admire me because that's inconceivable. Anyone would, but Paul shouldn't judge me too harshly for that, for just yelling at him, because that would be just me. So as long as that is me, that in stressful situations I throw temper tantrums, I'm saying I shouldn't be judged, and those around me, if they think that is just me, would not judge me because I'm being true to who I am. And often we'll narrate our lives that way, right? It's often about, as we've mentioned before, oh, I was kind of lost for a while when I was young, but then sometime around college, I began to find myself, find out who I really am. As I did so, I learned to embrace and love who I am. Things that I used to look down on myself for, I now realize that's just me, and I should love them. And once I come to love them, then I'm true to myself, and that allows me, of course, to truly flourish in what I can do. And that allows me to have an extraordinary life because I'm being true to who I really am. So the narration is always one of looking within, finding yourself. When you succeed in doing so, loving and embracing who you are and living your life accordingly. And conversely, of course, this is the judgment we will commonly make about people when they fail to do this. Like, oh, he really has not found himself, really. He's lost, and he really just needs to take some time off and just really find himself. And if we're critical of someone and, through a temper tantrum, again, it's okay if that's just them. If, on the contrary, it's, oh, my gosh, that person is just, they just can't really deal with life. They're just yelling at me all the time. Again, the standard refrain is they just need to take some time off and find themselves. In other words, if they do so, then they can find who they are and they'll stop acting badly in the world. So the screaming, to stick with that example, isn't the problem. It's if it's something that's true to who they are, screaming in a certain context, that's fine. The judgment is, oh, they're just screaming because they're lost in the world, they can't get it together. And again, the judgment is, and a sort of call to them in a good sense, we think, is, find yourself, be true to yourself, and then you can turn your life around. This, of course, is the standard narrative of many of the novels that start coming together in the 19th century and continue right through the current times. So standard coming of age novels usually involve the whole arc I just mentioned. They're lost. A crisis happens. In the midst of the crisis, they will finally find themselves, come to see who they are, respond to the crisis well because they now love who they are and can therefore act according to what is best for them in the world. And then things go wonderfully well. Or, of course, you can have the exact same arc done in a tragic sense. So, a lot of the 19th century romantic novels will play out the exact same arc, but often in a tragic sense, not because they don't find themselves, the protagonists, the tragic arc is society sadly isn't yet organized to support such people. So, a lot of the love novels will be like a woman caught in a horrible, horrible, deadening marriage, stifled in this horrible, dreary life. They then find themselves, often by meeting someone they fall desperately in love with. That then opens them up. They can then find who they really are. The love affair will occur, but then oftentimes it will end in horrible tragedy. But again, the sense is they did what they were supposed to do. The judgment here is on society. Sadly, society still supports the bourgeois drudgery of mundane married life, holding people back. So the judgment here is we need to change society such that it would support people who can truly live up to who they are. And following that larger arc in terms of the ways we often, at least in America, think of history, in America, the good narratives are often, well, in America, unlike in the 19th century, in both Europe and America, we have finally created a world where people can do this, right? And so that's why our novels tend to be less tragic nowadays in America, because the sense is, unlike, say, Madame Bovary, well, in America, you really can find yourself. And if you do, you will succeed, unlike these 19th century novels that, again, will often end in tragedy, where the person will find themselves, but then horrible tragedy erupts and everything falls apart because society isn't so organized. So the larger point here is becoming clear. I think that is a very standard arc of the ways we narrate lives, both in novelistic form, and again, just commonly when we talk about ourselves or make judgments of those around us. So if that is the case, let us then jump back to classical China, where, as we've been discussing these past few weeks, you see very different visions of agency and therefore very different narrations of lives and very different judgments about the degree to which people live life well or not. But not surprisingly, given the discussions we've been having these past few weeks, it does not come down to did they find themselves and stay true to who they really are. So how are the judgments made? So to make the argument, let me begin by giving a little bit more meat to some of the things we were discussing a few more weeks ago, just to introduce some key terms that will come up in some of the narratives that I'll be mentioning. So to do this, let me say a few words about a text excavated from Guodian. This was mentioned a few weeks ago. I'll just say a few more words about it, called The Nature That Emerges from the Decree, so the Xingziming Chu. And the reason I'm doing this is because it will introduce some terms that will be very helpful for discussing some of these narratives I'll be getting to momentarily. So the way the Xingziming Chu goes, and some of you may have read it, but hopefully this will be a quick reminder. Those of you who haven't read it, it's a very telling piece because it's sort of an early formulation of the things that people like Shunzi, etc., will be both, I would say, Mengzi and Shunzi, but more so Shunzi will be building on dramatically later. So the argument goes very quickly as follows. Humans do have a Xing, a nature. As we've already discussed, this nature is nothing like the true self that has become so standard in Euro-American thought. The Xing is, think of the Xing as this that which we have at birth. That's what it is. So when Shunzi famously will later say our Xing is, he doesn't mean we are inherently ugly, bad creatures. What it means is we have these bad tendencies, the tendencies to be very selfish and thinking only of ourselves. The implication being, well, therefore we need to train ourselves to become better. So Xing doesn't define us. Xing is simply what we're born with. The implication of a Xing argument is that's what you then need to be cultivating, working on, developing, etc. So the Xingziming Chu argument of this is we have this Xing, and because of this Xing, we tend to be, for reasons I'll get to momentarily, or rather the text will get to momentarily, very passive in the world. So we encounter things, which can be physical things, that can include people, situations, and we simply respond to those situations passively. The reason, as it will explain a few lines later, these are, of course, on bamboo strips, so a few strips later, is it will say part of our Xing is that we have a bunch of qi, these energies in us. We have qi of joy, of happiness, sadness, anger, etc. And when we encounter something, that encounter drags out from us our energy of X. So something good happens, that that moment, that good thing drags out from me an energy of happiness. So our danger is we're very passive in the world. That world of our just responding in as such, of our different energies being pulled out in situations, that the text will call our Qing. So our Qing, Ganqing to Qing. So our Qing is, think of it as our inherent dispositional response to the world. So the example being that I mentioned before, someone does something nice, I'm happy, meaning it drags out for me this energy of happiness. Someone does something mean, I'm angry, meaning something that act drags out for me an energy of anger. So that for this text is our Qing. I mentioned before, think of this the way that it's a Qing of a plant to move toward the sun. It's just its inherent dispositional response. We have Qing too. It's just our Qing is based on our these energies that get dragged out, things that we would now call emotions, but for the Xing Ziming Shu, these are just the energies and the way these energies get dragged out. So that is our Xing. Given that, the problem for the text, of course, is to say, how do we grow as human beings? Because the sense is the way we will inherently respond to the world is not going to be a particularly good response. There's nothing moral about this. There's nothing ethical about this. Our chi is not ethical in this way of thinking. And so what we need to do is have an intent, a jur, that needs to be deemed. We need to settle our intent and work on this. And the goal of doing this for this text is that we would be moving from Qing, this inherent dispositional response to the world, to Yi, responding properly to the world. Now, we'll see later some of these very similar narratives building out of this won't discuss this in ethical terms necessarily, but I'll just stick with the Xing Ziming Shu now to frame the argument. So if you can ding your jur, right, settle your intent and do it properly, as we will see, then you are moving from Qing, inherent dispositional responsiveness, to Yi, correctly responding. The key for the text, of course, being that you're not controlling your Qing in a strong sense because you still want to respond to the world. You're learning how to respond well. So the dinging of your jur means you don't overcome your Qing. You're working with it. You're refining it. You're getting better at sensing the world and sensing and working well. Now, the rest of the argument, I won't go into detail about because it's the focus on as to how to do it. And so here I'll just be much, much briefer so I can get to the narratives. But very briefly, the argument is the way you do it in essence is over the centuries or millennia of human history, actions were taken that in retrospect, people came to see as good responses that might have been utterly by accident. It's not necessarily that the people who did it were sages, but it comes to be seen as good. Therefore, those actions are remembered and replicated. And over time, you get a whole repertoire of these actions that have been taken. And over time, these accumulate. So you get a whole grouping of things that you raise the next generation in, where they are literally performing earlier good actions. The examples it will give are things like the following. So when the Zhou defeated the Shang, that was, according to the Xing Ziming Chu, a bloody affair. And so they did overthrow the Shang king. Although the text doesn't mention it, elsewhere we know they beheaded the king. There was a bloody war, blah, blah, blah. So potentially a horrible thing. Nonetheless, people retrospectively came to see that as a good thing. It was It was the people righteously standing up to a horrible authoritarian figure. And insofar as it was, that became remembered and literally performed. So you have an entire musical performance of the Wu, the martial songs, focused on the overthrow of the Shang. Each generation replays this, and the goal of doing that is you are developing your Qing, right? You're developing your sense of righteous anger. This isn't just pure anger. Somebody yells at me and I get angry. This is a righteous anger. So you're taking this chi of anger and you're developing it and refining it. So in a situation where you are dealing with a horrible authority figure, it's a righteous anger that you're developing. And that's just one example among many. You have equal ones for love, you have for family, all of these. And then, after these have been accumulating, a sage, presumably this is a reference to Confucius, organizes these into different arenas for education: ritual, music, the documents, and the shi. And all of these are clearly performances for the text. In other words, the shi are all about things you would utter in a certain situation. The documents are great statements made by great figures at certain moments that we literally will repeat. So we will literally repeat the Duke of Zhou stating X, Y, or Z. So by doing so, we again refine our chi. And same with music. The example I've given, the overthrow of the Zhou, rituals, all about, again, refining your chi. If you're doing this, you are becoming more responsive to the world. And all of this for the text is ultimately about dinging your jur, right? You're getting your intent right so you can act properly in the world, not because you'll just automatically be, overthrowing people in a martial way, but all that training is allowing you to sense the situation and respond well. Now, the reason I'm bringing you through this is not to say every narrative in early China follows the Xinzi Chu way of thinking. They certainly do not, and the focus on ethics is, needless to say, not going to be the focus necessarily. However, I think a lot of these terms are very helpful for thinking through how narratives are being developed, why they're being developed, and how and why people are being judged. So to give some examples, let me turn to one of our texts that includes tons and tons of stories about people, namely Sima Qian's Shiji. So we're jumping a couple of centuries, obviously, and I'm not claiming Sima Qian even read the Xinzi Chu. We have no idea, but he is certainly coming out of a tradition of thinking about the self, and he is narrating lives with a, I will argue, vision. He absolutely is judgmental about figures. He loves certain figures. He hates other figures. More commonly, as we will see, he loves certain things people do sometimes. And then the ultimate criticism for an arc of a life is, did they fully live up to this, or did they ultimately fail to at some crucial moment? And I will argue it's a pretty consistent pattern that you can discern how he is going through the past and judging people. And I think he wants us to learn something from this. And so here, let me turn to that. What do I think he's doing? Like, how do these narratives work? What is he trying to point to? And ultimately, where do his judgments lie? So I'll pick a few examples. I'll intentionally pick some relatively well-known ones because some of these, if you haven't physically read the biography, you've probably at least heard the story of their lives or heard about them. And I'll occasionally mention some people you might have heard less about, and we'll give you more details as necessary. But let me begin with some ones that you probably either have read or at least know the general arc of. So let me begin with Jing Ke. Jing Ke, as many of you know, because there have been many stories told about him, including recent movies, was the would-be assassin of the figure who would ultimately become the first emperor. So Jing Ke is the figure who tries to go to the court of the king of Qin right when the king is successfully leading these armies that we know ultimately will overtake all of China. Sima Qian certainly knows that. He's living in the Han Dynasty. And Jing Ke goes to him and tries to assassinate him. Just to remind you, because you've probably seen movies about this, this is the guy who comes in with a map, with his dagger hidden in the map, and he tries to show the king the map, and at the key moment grabs the dagger and tries to kill the king. I won't say more until I get the actual narrative, but that's just to remind you of who this person is, if you've seen the many movies in which he plays a significant role. Now, the way that he's described, however, is very telling. So, to begin with, why does he get a chapter in a work like the Shurji? And Sima Qian does, at the very end, as you know, he will give these arcs of a life, and then at the very end, will give you a judgment about them. And he will explain why he has a whole chapter on these would-be assassins, Jin Ke being the most famous ones. You could argue, if this is going to be a text showing exemplary figures, why in the world would a would-be assassin, someone who tried to kill a king, be in there? And his defense is intriguing. You could imagine, well, he was standing up to a figure we know was going to be a bad king. That's not so much his argument. His argument is that Jin Ke, and we'll see this is a consistent argument along several of his biographies, Jin Ke, I'll try to use an ambiguous word for reasons that become obvious momentarily as I get into the biography. He did not go against his jur, right? He lived up to his jur, his intent. So now let me give the arc, and then I'll come back to why I'm sort of phrasing that so oddly. So here is the arc that Sima Qian will narrate. So early on in his life, Jin Ke is presented as someone who is not very good at living up to situations and in a very consistent pattern. He runs away from them. So very consistently, someone will challenge him and he literally will run away. And you get a few examples of this where something will happen, he will be challenged, and then he literally scurries off and then moves away. And so consistently, he's just running away. So translating this into the language we were using before, he had clearly fallen into a dispositional response to the world in which he would run from potential danger. Now, that's not necessarily good or bad, but the key, as we'll see for Sima Qian, is when you fall into a pattern, that is always going to be potentially dangerous because you're no longer responding to the world. You're just doing the same sort of thing over and over and over again. And so even in a situation where that might be a perfectly good thing, like this isn't a place where you'd want to stand up and fight, the concern for Sima Qian, and we'll see this over and over again, is we tend to fall into ways of responding to the world at a very young age, and then sometimes we don't change. So let me continue with Jin Ke before I get to the larger arc. So he runs away, he runs away, he runs away. Then he meets someone who's a great lute player, and the two of them just become drunkards together. They just start drinking all the time, and they'll hang out in the marketplace, and his friend will play the lute, and Jin Ke will sing along, and then they drink all day. So they just have a really, really, really fun life. That is Jin Ke at the early stage. Then the turning point is when the wars begin. And the wars from the state of Qin are becoming greater and greater. And a series of events, and I won't take you through all the details, but a series of events occur in which people who have been devastated by the Qin armies are growing increasingly angry, and there's a sense that the ruler of the Qin must be stopped, that this is absolutely horrible and it must be stopped. And one of the figures who has been absolutely devastated by all of this goes into an area where Jin Ke, the drunkard, is living, and one of Jinke's friends is talking to him and explaining the situation and saying, we've got to stop the king, but how in the world do we do it? How could you even get close to the king of Chen? He's obviously guarded by the strongest mass infantry armies in the entire world at this stage. How would you ever do it? And Jinke says, well, but actually, the general who has just come into our territory, um, the king of Qin wants his head. And his friend says, well, he can't take his head. And he goes, well, I'll talk to him. So he talks to the general and says, if you will let me take your head, um, I can use it to get close to the king and kill him. And the general says, okay, cuts his own throat. They cut off his head, and it begins. What is so intriguing about that whole arc is Sima Qian is not giving us any hint as to exactly why this transition is occurring. I think the reason, and I'll try to argue this is a very consistent pattern, is what Sima Qian is saying is at this moment, his pattern, Jinke's, would have been just to run away, run away. A clearly potentially dangerous situation is coming in where he is going to get entangled in a very, very dangerous situation. And instead, the sense is at this moment, he recognizes he needs to do something. And there's this dramatic shift. But again, he doesn't find himself, he doesn't look within. He simply realizes now is a moment when I have to shift my typical response pattern to the world and respond in a very different way. And so suddenly, Jinke, of all people, and the suddenly is, I don't think, putting it too strongly at all in terms of this arc, suddenly, takes the head and marches off to the kingdom of Qin, gains an audience with the king of Qin, and here does what I mentioned before. The plan is I'll go in with the head and I'll have a map with the dagger rolled in. With the head, I get the audience. I unroll the map. I then pull out the dagger and kill the king. And obviously he's dead. At most he'll succeed, but obviously he's going to be killed if he pulls this thing off. And again, as we well know, because the king does become the first emperor, it ultimately fails. But it fails not because of any, according to Sima Qian's portrait of it, not because of any inherent failure. It simply fails because at a certain moment he didn't quite respond perfectly, and therefore he's not able to pull off the assassination, and then of course he is killed. But the whole arc is here is this person whose pattern is to run away from danger, at a certain moment realizes, no, I now need to be ready to meet this moment, tries to meet the moment, and if there is an implicit criticism, the sense would be, and this is actually stated by one of his lute player friend, had he earlier been practicing swordsmanship more, instead of just being such a drunkard, maybe he could have pulled this off. And the drunkard lute player says, had I seen what was really there, that he was capable of this, I would have, helped him learn how to be a better swordsman, and we wouldn't have spent so much time drinking. So the sense is he had this inherent pattern. The goodness from, well, not ethically, but what so much him loves about him is that at a certain moment, he recognized, now I have to live up to this moment. He shifts completely from his standard pattern, undergoes this attempted assassination that by definition will lead to his own death. And the only potential criticism you could make of Jinke once he gets his jur settled, this is what I'm going to do to meet the moment. The only implicit criticism is he should have, sticking with the language we saw from the Xing Zimin Chu, he needed to ding his jur earlier. Because if he had dinged his jur a little bit earlier and drunk a little bit less and been practicing his swordsmanship a little bit better, he would have been more capable at that moment. But the problem was not a jur problem, right? So the reason Sima Qian loves him is his jur was there. He got his jur right. That is why, to go back to the phrasing, I think what Sima Qian is saying there, we can't doubt his jur, is I think really what Sima Qian is saying. Like people who criticize him, they're missing the point. His jur was there. We cannot criticize his jur. If there's a criticism, he should have been a better swordsman. He should have been drinking a lot less. He should have done this a little bit earlier. Still, it was his jur that was right, which is why Sima Qian kind of loves Jinka. Not that he's a great sage, but loves him because in that arc, he at that key moment, responded well. Now, let me give another example, and then a couple more very much briefer examples before I get to the larger point. Here's an intriguing one. Lisa. So Lisa, as all of you know, is the prime minister of the state of Jin. So he's the guy that really successfully was the architect of the empire. So in the story that I've been telling of Jinke trying to kill the king, of course, the key figure here is arguably not the king, it's Lisa. Lisa is the prime minister who, according to many narratives, but Sima Qian will certainly agree with this, is really the architect of the empire. He's the one that really got the policies down that won the empire. It's important to note before I get into the narrative, Lisa is also, for that very reason, despised in the Han Dynasty, right? So by the time Sima Qian is writing this, the Qin, yes, had a great military victory, but it fell very soon thereafter, less than 20 years thereafter. Yes, Lisa was the prime minister who successfully won the wars. However, he is also the one that, at least according to narratives, and Sima Qian will accept these narratives, was worried about losing his own power at court when the first emperor was dying, faked a whole series of things to get a really dumb second emperor in power so Lisa could maintain his own ability to really run the court. Things begin to fall apart horribly when factions finally begin successfully developing against Lisa, and then Lisa is captured and charged with treason and suffers a horrible death as the whole empire collapses around him. So he is seen as this incredibly vicious character who, yes, won the wars, but really brings down a toppling of the empire. He also, of course, was seen, and so much implies this too, as key to the death of Han Feizi, literally giving him the poison in prison after he had slandered Han Feizi to the king of Qin. So this is a guy who is not well thought of in the Han Dynasty. So then you read the biography of Sima Qian. And it is not a purely negative biography at all. Now, it ultimately, as we will see at the end, Sima Qian will give a very, very strong critique. However, it's not that, oh, Han Feizi is just this horrible, evil figure. Not at all. So the whole narrative, like all of his narratives, it begins with his childhood. And the childhood of Lisa, as narrated by Sima Qian, is he's born into very low economic situation, and he sees the different lives of rats. And he notices that the rats who are in certain places trying to get food get killed. The rats who are able to make it into storehouses where they're not seen can just eat the grain and lie around and be full all the time, and they have a great life. And his reading of this is it all depends on circumstances. So I must learn where I can be to be the equivalent of the rat in the storehouse. And he decides the place, well, I'm jumping again a little bit. So then he gets educated with, of all people, Shunza, but decides that the place where he can be the equivalent of the rat in the storehouse is the kingdom of Qin. Why? Because the kingdom, of course, is beginning its build up toward what we know will be the successful wars. And Lisa thinks because of this, they are going to be willing to hire lots of incredibly capable people who are not born into high circumstances, but nonetheless, if I can convince them that I'm very capable, I could get hired there and could have this flourishing life. So he tells Shunza, I'm leaving because I'm going to the state of Qin where I can be the equivalent of a rat in the storehouse. So that's a pretty negative portrait, right? But then it begins to shift. So he goes to the state of Jin, as we know, he of course does in fact gain a position and starts working his way up. But then you get a shift. And again, it's not a looking within, finding myself kind of shift. What he begins to realize is it isn't just circumstance, that actually you have to really be good at working with situations constantly. So it's not, in other words, that you are it's not that the rat's luckily found a storehouse and he needs to be the equivalent of the rat luckily finding a storehouse. It's rather you need to really train yourself to sense situations constantly. So you, in a sense, are creating the favorable circumstances, which is precisely what, in his opinion, rats, well, he comes to realize, I should say, rats were not doing. They kind of got lucky. And he begins to realize, no, 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 I need to really understand situations. He begins to use his jur, right? And here's where it gets even more intriguing as he becomes more and more successful, there's a very consistent portrait where Sima Qian will take you into incredible detail about situation after situation. It's a very, very long chapter. That's in part just because he had more documents, presumably, but also, even so, he takes you into such detail. And the reason narratively, I think, is very clear. Narratively, he's giving you the detail because he is trying to show you how, moment by moment, Han Feizi is getting really, really, really good at sensing situations. Now, not morally, he's not presented as a moral figure, but he is presented as this incredibly ruthless figure, but sensing situations incredibly, incredibly well. And once you get to the whole rise of the empire, it becomes, I don't think I'm exaggerating too much, a pretty positive portrayal. Now, not morally, he's consistently ruthless, but you start to get a sense that Sima Qian thinks, okay, this guy really did end the wars because he successfully got the Qin policies figured out that finally brought an end to the Warring States period. And he did it because moment by moment, he was just able to so correctly sense things. And those sensing things means literally how to flatter the king to get him to do what needed to be done, often against what the king wanted to do, how to talk to the different generals to get them to do things, how to respond to the different states and treaties to him. And he becomes incredibly good at this. And the sense is, I don't think, again, I'm exaggerating too much. I think it's a very clear arc. He was doing what needed to be done at that moment to bring the warring states to an end. And the sense was, had he continued in this, he maybe could have been an incredible prime minister because then the wars are won and suddenly you have a possibility for true peace. And at this point, he has almost untouchable power because the king trusts him completely. And the sense was he really did learn that, again, he's not just a rat luckily sitting in a granary storehouse. Like he really learned that you must sense situations and act and even act ruthlessly at a certain moment to bring a horrible period of history to an end. Then the shift begins in a negative way. But it's again a very telling negative portrayal. So once it gets negative, the sense was at that moment, then it begins to go to his head. And now, so incredibly good at sensing situations, but now it ceases to be all about how to successfully bring an end to the wars. It returns to kind of being the rat in the storehouse model, where it's all about him getting his goodies. And more, he starts getting incredibly focused on his own power, incredibly insecure that maybe the king will start listening to other people. He has to start wiping out everyone else. He begins to overly enjoy the trappings of his own position. And then Sima Chen does follow the narrative that indeed he plays a key role in getting the second emperor, a not very intelligent guy, onto the throne when the first emperor is dying, simply so he can enhance his power. And then from then it's a purely negative portrayal. Then it's all about him. It's a question of what factions can finally get rid of this person. And then you get to the conclusion. And the judgment is, well, kind of an encapsulation of what I've just mentioned. The sense is we are wrong to see Lisa as a purely bad person. Actually, he was an unbelievably effective person at working in situations. He did, at a key moment in human history, what needed to be done. It was good to end the wars, and he successfully brought them to an end. He brought about peace. But the sense was he never really dealt with that pattern that he had fallen into from this incredibly young age. And he fell simply into I'm going to create a world where I'm the rat in the granary, just eating my fill endlessly. And the sense was he had this pattern of responses. He really seemed to have developed kind of the good side of those for the height of his career. But then what destroyed him and destroyed the entire Qin Empire is he fell back into the worst tendencies that you can trace back to his childhood. And here, let me make the larger point. I'll touch on some more examples, but I think there's enough here to begin to make the larger point. I think the pattern, and it's very consistent in Sima Qian, is if you start at a young age, we fall into patterns of responses. These are what the Xing Zimin would call our inherent Qing. But for Sima Qian, it's whether we're born with this, whether it's just patterns we fall into from a young age because of circumstances. Sima Qian will say nothing about that. What he is interested in is saying, we have certain patterns we fall into. Those become inherent to us. They're kind of the equivalent again of our Qing, as the Xing Zimin Chu would describe it. And then the judgment is always about the degree to which you do or do not work on them. And if you can successfully work on them, and you do so by your intent, your jur, and if with your jur, you can actually live up to moments at the key moments when we need to respond well, if you do it, you get so much Qian's praise. Even someone like Li So will get it at the key moments during the build-up to the end of the wars. Full, complete praise. But when you fail to live up to the moment, and particularly when you fall back into your dangerous tendencies, that's when you get the criticism. So with that, let me just give a couple more examples here. I'll be much more brief. Xiang Yu is another great example. So this is the great heroic figures you'll remember who, after the Qin falls, the civil war breaks out. The two final factions battling for the throne are Xiang Yu and Liu Bang. As we know, Liu Bang ultimately wins, and Sima Qian does not terribly like Liu Bang. And he writes, on the contrary, a wonderful Banji. So it's not even one of the biographies. He gets a full Banji to himself of the incredible heroic Xiang Yu. So Sima Qian loves him, but again, it's not a purely good portrait, and ultimately, it's a negative portrait, ultimately. And I won't go into as much detail, but the standard arc is the one that I've been describing. So Xiang Yu, the problem Xiang Yu falls into from an incredibly young age is he is incredibly arrogant and incapable of truly listening to others. And in his rise, he begins to finally listen to others enough. He starts winning these battles. People begin flocking to him. He's this incredibly charismatic figure. He perfectly meets a few key moments. And then the negative moment is it all falls apart because right when, at the key moment in the Civil War, the final battles against Liu Bang, he again ceases to listen to people. And it's his downfall. And why does Liu Bang win? If you look at the arc of Liu Bang, it's almost entirely negative, but Liu Bang does one thing, which is Liu Bang learns to listen to other people. And he listens to his advisors, and at this key moment, Xiang Yu can't, Liu Bang does, and Liu Bang wins the Civil War. The implication, of course, being it's not that Liu Bang was a better person. It's very clear Sima Qian likes Zhang Yu much better, and he likes him much better for the very clear reason, which is he had this amazing jerk. Like he really, truly lived up to the moment over and over again until the key moment when he missed the moment. Let me now make the larger point, just underlining what I was saying before. That, I think, is what Sima Qian is looking at. If we fall into certain patterns of responses, we're incapable of meeting the moment, right? So I think Sima Qian's critique there, sort of putting it more explicitly than he will, he's writing these more implicitly, but laying out what I think is generally his view is if you're falling into patterns of responses, you're not really responding, right? Like there's no way you can meet the complexity of a situation because you'll just fall back into standard patterns of responses. And the consistent arc, positive, negative, or often sort of, moment by moment, positive, then negative, or vice versa, is to the degree to which people cultivate themselves with their jur and learn to meet moments. And that is consistently when he will give praise, or very consistently where he will give criticisms. Did this person meet their moment? And you meet your moment through, and I literally, I think every narrative I've been able to find seems to follow this pattern. You can meet your moment if you have dinged your jur. He doesn't use the ding as much, but if you have a clear jur, you break your common way of responding and you sense the situation well and you respond to it. And that response may mean the end of your life, but if you respond well, those are the people we should praise, even a would-be assassin, but we also need to horribly criticize those who cannot meet the moment. And consistently, they can't meet the moment because they fall back into their standard responses at the key moment when they cannot do that. And that is what they do. It's why ultimately Lisa fails. It is why ultimately a Xiang Yu fails. It's why he still loves Jing Ke. It's why at certain moments he actually is very positive about Lisa. It's all about, do you meet your moment? And a couple of final examples. If you read the biography of Confucius, I think this is exactly the whole arc. So not surprisingly, so much in will praise Confucius as a great sage, but he's not a great sage until the very, very end of his life. And the key thing is I'm sorry, Confucius is continually trying to have a political career, sort of not living up to the moments. Like example after example of where Confucius thinks, okay, it's going to be better if I get more power, then I can do good things. And he does some pretty not good things, according to Sima Qian, and fails, 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 fails. And then finally, at the end, he realizes what it is he can do to meet the moment. And meeting the moment, of course, is writing the Chunshou, editing the other classics. And that is how he is able to meet the moment and do these great things that then allows a possibility of altering the world for the better. I think implicitly that is Sima Qian's claim for himself. He is claiming, I am trying to meet my moment in the only way I now can after my horrible punishment. So how do I respond to the horrible punishment and the horrible way I've been treated? And I think implicitly what he's saying is, this work is my response. And if it is successful, I am living up to this moment. I am like Confucius in that sense, living up to this moment, doing what I need to do. And as he says, hopefully future sages will see what I'm doing, just as I am recognizing people like Lisa and Qing Ke at the certain moments when they did it too. But hopefully I'll be more like the Confucius who at the final moment really truly lives up to the moment. So adding this up, it is a very different vision of an arc of a life. It's a very different type of making judgments. Now, I've stuck with only one example, so much in, but I think I would like to still not say everyone follows that model, but make the following argument, which is I think you will look in vain for early Chinese narratives that follow along the looking within, finding oneself. Do they or do they not successfully love and embrace who they really are? And the judgments coming down either way. Very consistently, the sort of thing you're seeing in Sima Qian, lots of variations, of course, but it's that sort of thing. It's if we fall into certain patterns, Do we develop enough, cultivate ourselves enough to be able to break from those, to work with situations, or do we fail to? Sima Qian doesn't really think of this ethically. You know, the Xing Zhiminchu will think of it much more ethically. Some narratives are very, very ethical, others are much less so. However, that move that we're judging people on the degree to which they cultivate themselves, break out of their standard responses, sense situations well, and respond effectively, that is often the arc of these narratives. It's the basis on which judgments are made. And I think it's fascinating to think of that as a way to judge a life, one's own life, and judge the lives of others. So, with that as a quick statement about these biographies, autobiographies, visions, and judgments of the self, let us, as always, open this up for conversation, thoughts, questions, but feel free to bring in other examples of narratives from either recent Euro-American traditions or from the classical period. So yeah, let's open this up. Great, Jonah, please.
Yeah, yeah, thanks for this. This is really interesting. I read the letter to Ren An in the fall, so that's what I was thinking about as we went through
Oh, cool.
this, right? That, this whole
Yes,
narrative that he tells of himself is this narrative of like staying true to his intention, and then
yeah,
only then, and it's kind of an act of faith. But then, only at the end of a life can we judge whether we did right or wrong is right, and that's like, so
yes,
he's this is
exactly.
how he judges others and it's how he judges himself, so that itself is just really, yeah, awesome.
I,
Really
I
interesting.
agree completely. I think you're exactly right. I think that is exactly what he is saying in the letter to Renan. I think he is exactly saying he's making a claim that yes, I always followed my jur, and that's how
Right.
I should be judged. Exactly. That's why I'm doing what
Cool.
I'm doing. That's why I didn't commit suicide in response to, the standard thing to do if you get what you consider to be an unacceptable punishment, this case being castrated, you would commit suicide in protest. And yeah, the whole letter is basically saying, I didn't because with my juror, I knew the way to respond on the contrary was to write this work. And I think you're exactly right. That is the claim he's making for himself. Yes.
Cool. So I'm thinking, I wonder that if what we can say about the classical Chinese texts is that they don't promote the idea of authenticity, but they do promote a kind of an idea of integrity,
Yeah.
closer to that ideal, right? So you want to be, true to your project. And for someone like Sima Qian, the exact content of your project is not as important. For Xunzi, it's very important. For Xunzi Mingqiu, it's maybe important. But Sima Qian is more of this like kind of more modern, individualistic type, right? That's more familiar to us, maybe. And I'm thinking of like the French existentialists, right? That for them, they're against the idea of this like authentic self in the kind of vulgar American sense, let's say, of this essence that you then kind of work out. Rather, you are, existence comes first, and then you try to you set up a project, and the standards by which to judge yourself or others is the to what extent do you meet the demands of the moment? Do you make the choice between taking care of your ailing mother or going off to join the Free French Forces? And do you, stay true to the project that you've set up for yourself with your intentions? So maybe some chance, some kind of existentialist, we could say.
Yeah, no, I love this. And I think integrity is a wonderful word. And yeah, I love the comparison with the existentialists. And of course, here too, there's a nuanced difference, exactly building on what you're saying, that's also telling because, as you said, going back to the first part of what you're saying, Xingzi Minqiu, Shunzi, definitely for them, these need to be moral projects. And so much in has very little to say about that. Like he was Jinko morally right to try to kill the king of Qin? Sima Qian gives no hints of this. It's really, as you said, and I love your word, integrity. But even here, one thing that's intriguing, so the existentialists, as you said, will really focus on the project of a life. And with Sima Qian, it's much more like how you respond to situations. So he's less judging the degree to which you live up to your project and much more do you live up to the moment, and that moment for him, like when he's praiseworthy, that moment kind of defines your project, right? So Confucius, according to Sima Qian, it's not that his project was right. In fact, most of his life project was not right, according to Confucius. Like he just wasn't a very good politician, and he shouldn't have kept selling his soul for lowly bureaucratic positions. But the sense is the turning point was when he met the moment. That moment, then, as you said, became his project. That moment was, oh, here is how I can live up to the moment, which was, as you said, his project. Like, and Sima Qian, I think, is definitely making the same claim for himself. I'm living up to the moment. My project, like Confucius's Chunqiu, my project is the Shiji. But it's an intriguing claim. It's not my life as a project. It's how do I live up to this moment? And then sometimes that living up to the moment out of that will come a life project. But it's kind of the how do you respond to the moment? And so yeah, I agree with you. I think it's a wonderful comparison, and I think yeah, integrity is a great way to develop this. It's not, as you said, it's not really authenticity, it's integrity. And then looking at different ways integrity plays out in different philosophical traditions is wonderful. So thank you. This is incredibly
Yeah,
helpful.
thanks. I might have more to say, but I'll pass on to someone else first.
If I could
Okay,
just add,
please, of course, of
Michael,
course.
just to rephrase basically your response, right? That it's also this sort of difference, right? Is just rephrasing what you said is one of them takes the external as a standard and the other one doesn't. Right. So for
Fascinating.
the
Fascinating.
existentialists, basically, to use Richard Rorty, right? Just thus I willed it, right? The fact that you will it is enough, right? And then if you
Exactly.
want to look at a standard sort of Confucian response, is this kudzi fuli, right? To restrain
Exactly.
yourself and then look to the external, right? So there's definitely a lot of
Yes.
overlap there that's really interesting, I think, to explore in a more nuanced way. But yeah, there is this sort of there's also this critical sort of difference.
It definitely. And
Mm.
just building on that, so the term jur I've been translating sort of intent. Often that's translated as will. And the reason I've not been translating will is for exactly this reason, because it's definitely not a triumph of the will model. It's not, I, with my will, I will do the following and, the world be damned. It's my will and the world will either follow me or not. So I'll succeed or not, but I'll be true to my will. And I agree, it's for so much in, it's not that, it's really the intent, and the intent is really about cultivating oneself to live up to moments. And the live up to moments are definitely, these are external, it's circumstances that we find ourselves in, but can we, in those circumstances, respond? So if I'm, about to have my, if I'm going to be castrated for defending my friend, can I respond to that moment? So it's absolutely, it's not, here's my life project that I'm designing with my will, the world be damned. It's how do I respond to the world and make a better world because I will sense it correctly at the key moments. So yeah, this is very productive. Thank you.
To maybe sharpen the contrast in Sartre's case of like the that I referenced of the guy choosing between two, saving, taking care of his mother and not. For Sima Chen, maybe there would be a correct answer there. It would be the answer being, what the situation calls for. Whereas for the existentialists, it's like for Sartre, it's like you just have to make a choice. That's what matters. But now
Yeah,
I
yeah,
really feel move to
yeah.
someone else.
But yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Very helpful. And not surprising, lots and lots of hands. So I'll just go by the order. So Angela, please.
Okay, well, I agree that Sima Qian believes in Confucianism, except there are other philosophical schools at that time. And I also know that he wants people form a responsive pattern. But I wonder whether all the affairs are predetermined. Maybe there are some contingency. For example, people have their destiny, their mean, and sometimes just their destinies are not so good. Even though they respond to others to the environment properly, they will not have a good result. For example, in the analogs, there's a person named Bo Niu, and actually he falls ill seriously, and Confucius feel very pity for that because he thinks that Bo Niu is a nobleman. He did everything very well, but he also have a short life or so. Another kind of contingency may be the bad environment. Also in the analogs, there's a one time that Zilu and Confucius, they meet an old man, and man criticized that they don't know how to cultivate crops. And that old man want to hide himself from the society, and Confucius criticized him that he does not work how to say cultivate him to follow the rituals. And actually, I know my Tao will not work out, but I still insist on that because this is what I should do. So even though the environment is not so good, Confucius insists on that. So maybe sometimes they also have their autonomy and they can just do something on their own will.
Yes, I agree completely. These are wonderful examples. And just to underline them, so there famously was an attempt, and maybe a few other minor ones, but in the classical period, an attempt by the Moists to try to argue it's a completely moral cosmos. If you do good, you'll be rewarded. If you do bad, you'll be punished. So there's no Ming. So there's no, it's if I'm good, I will be rewarded, period. Needless to say, virtually everyone rejects that position. And I fully agree with you. Everyone is different from a Confucius to a Sima Qian. On the contrary, are absolutely committed to the idea that no, it is an ever-changing world. There are circumstances. As you said, the term that will often be used is Ming. So as Mengzi says, Ming is just the stuff that we can't control, which is most of the world. And I think Sima Qian would agree with this. So for Sima Qian, the judgment is, do we meet the moment? So when something happens, do we respond effectively? And that's the effectiveness is again something we can only judge later according to did they fully sense the situation and respond? But that doesn't mean that they got rewarded. They could then die for it. Absolutely. And so most of our lives are Ming. It's the things we can't control. And the question is, do we respond well to the world into which we are constantly being thrown? And even if we respond perfectly, I can still die young, horrible things will still happen to me. And you're absolutely right. For Sima Qian, that's the equivalent of Ming. But the judgment comes down is, do you meet the moment or not? So yeah, I think that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, so can I say that for
Of course.
Confucius or for Sima Qian, even though I do moral actions, I may not have my welfare. I just
Oh,
should do my moral responsibilities.
absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. And if so much in, I think he would not even necessarily be committed to the moral part of that. I think his commitment would be responding well is what we're going to judge. However, people like Confucius, absolutely, it's about morality. But even there, we can be totally moral and horrible things will happen to us. So Yin Hui, his favorite disciple, dies young. That's his name. And it's horrible, devastatingly tragic, and yet this is what happens. And Mencius will say the same. I can, if I'm acting to be rewarded because I think good things will come, I'm not really acting morally. So I must act morally, and then horrible things may happen to me, but that's me. And I think that's absolutely Sima Qian would agree. He would just take out the moral part. but I live up to the moment as best I can, and that's what I should be judged on. And then horrible things will still happen to me. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, very helpful. Thank you so much. And Demetra, please.
Yes, I was just thinking about the idea of the tragic and how we talk about its absence, right, in the Chinese tradition. So I'm imagining Sima Qian having a conversation with Oedipus, right? And the one missing
Yeah.
two eyes and the other one missing something else, right? So they're having this conversation, and Oedipus asks Sima Qian, how did this happen to you? And Sima Qian says, well, I did not respond to the moment, whatever. I did respond to the moment, and yeah, this is what I got, right? This is the Ming. What about you? How did you end up like this? And Oedipus would say, well, I responded to the moment fully, right? My zhi was very dinged, right? And but there's a problem with us. And Sumachen would say, what? And Oedipus would say, well, there's a ceiling. There is a ceiling, and there are the gods there. So there's another agency at play there, right?
Yes.
So in Sima Qian's case, we might say that if the divine is part of the idea of the tragic, right, in the Western tradition, we might say that for Sima Qian, for the Chinese tradition, it would be the ground. It would not be the ceiling, right, above which you cannot somehow reach, but it would be the ground, like, of reality. Like that's how it is. Like, and there is no whatever. It is also uncontrollable for us, but it's not like an how do you call it, capricious agency, right?
Yes.
It's a capricious word, right? It's random, but it's not a capricious agency, divine agency there. So yeah,
Yes.
I was thinking about, I wonder.
Oh, fascinating. Yes, I love that because you're right. In early Greece, it's very often, as you said, the equivalents of these horrible things that happen to us are very often attributed to those capricious gods and goddesses up there. And so it's them jumping down and doing horrible things to us for, their own ridiculous reasons. And that's why we're living in a capricious world. Whereas you're absolutely right in classical China. And I love your terminology here. That's the world. That the world is fundamentally like that. And some people will occasionally say it's because of these, capricious divine powers. Some will just say it's literally the world. Some will kind of go back and forth. So Mencius, like is heaven actively intervening, doing horrible things? Sometimes he says that. Other times it's just Ming. Who knows? Even Confucius, like when Yin Hui dies, he says, "Heaven, you're destroying me." The sense seems to be heaven is responsible, but elsewhere it just seems to be, this is just the world. And I agree. So I love your phrasing.
It's ambiguous.
It's just ambiguous, and it's just the ground.
Yeah.
It's the world we live in. Maybe it's because they're capricious powers. Maybe it's just a weird world, and different people will give different explanations. The same people will give different explanations, but I think that just makes your point, which is that's just the world. We don't understand it. We can give different explanations for it, but regardless, that's the world we have to live with. And therefore, it's all about, do you live up to the moment? Because even when you do, horrible things may happen to you. And I agree, it's a very different vision than like, we humans can build a world of justice. It's just those gods, they'll break in and do horrible things to us. And I think you're right. In China, that's the world. The world is just, that's a messy, capricious world. And again, we can describe it in different ways. We can explain it in different ways, but the explanations don't carry the power. That's just the world we have to live in. Yeah, thank you.
So I think I'm going to interrupt. Sorry, Jonah. And James also had a question. I think next week we should continue with the discussion.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I also might have a longer response too. So Jonah, if that's okay, if you and James can keep your questions because we don't really have time, but then next week I think we can just do discussion, basically, continue this.
Wonderful, wonderful. So apologies to both James and Jonah. But yes, next week we'll simply